Ever feel like your voice just gets lost in all the noise of the two-party system?
Yeah, it can definitely seem like that sometimes.
Like, is there even an option beyond just red or blue?
You're not the only one who feels that way.
Well, on this deep dive, we're going beyond the usual suspects, exploring the world of third parties in U.S. politics.
These are the groups who dared to say, nope, not good enough.
They challenge the big guys and sometimes actually change the course of American history.
It's a story that goes all the way back to the very beginning, the founding fathers.
Wait, so the guys who literally wrote the rules of the game weren't fans of having multiple parties?
Yeah, they weren't big on it. They saw these parties, they called them factions back then, as like a real danger to the country.
Interesting.
Yeah, they thought it would divide everyone. You can find some pretty strong words from John Adams and Thomas Jefferson about this.
So then how did we end up with parties in the first place?
Well, good question. Because even the founding fathers, with all their wisdom, they had some serious disagreements themselves.
I can imagine.
Especially about how powerful the federal government should be. And those arguments, well, that's how we got the first two major parties.
The Federalists and the, was it Democratic Republicans?
Exactly. The Federalists, with Alexander Hamilton leading the charge, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson.
I'm guessing those two didn't exactly send each other birthday cards.
Not really. Their rivalry was intense. We're talking personal attacks, nasty stuff in the newspapers, really trying to discredit each other.
So much for civil discourse, right?
Yeah, not quite what we might hope for today.
Yeah.
But it's within those early parties that we see the first stirrings of a third option.
Oh, really?
In 1806, a bunch of Republicans who weren't happy with Jefferson's direction, they split off and formed what was called the Tertium Quids.
Tertium Quids. Sounds like a Harry Potter spell.
It means like a third something, showing they were outside the two main groups. They were kind of like early populists,
Populists meaning?
They wanted policies that helped the everyday person, not just the elites. So right from the start, we see this desire for a voice outside the system.
Makes you wonder if it was a constant uphill battle going against those political giants.
Oh, it definitely was. But there's one area where third parties really started to make waves, and that's the fight against slavery.
Right.
In the 1800s, we see parties like the Liberty Party. These folks were driven by a deep moral conviction to get rid of slavery, no question.
I bet that wasn't an easy cause to champion back then.
No, sir. Initially, they leaned heavily on religious arguments, but that wasn't going to convince everyone.
So how do they get their message to resonate more broadly?
Well, that's where a guy named Salmon P. Chase comes in. Really clever strategist. He shifted the conversation away from just religion.
And towards?
He framed it as a fight between states' rights and the power of the federal government.
Interesting strategy.
He said, look, individual states, maybe they get to choose, but the federal government shouldn't be pro-slavery, especially in new territories.
Makes sense.
And this approach, it clicked with more people, even those worried about the economic impact of slavery spreading.
Smart. But even with this broader appeal, the Liberty Party never won the presidency, did they?
You're right, they didn't. But they still made an impact. Like in 1844, their candidate, James G. Birney, got enough votes to sway the election.
Seriously?
Took votes away from the Whig candidate, Henry Clay, and helped James K. Polk win. Classic spoiler effect.
Yeah.
Made the big parties pay attention.
Wow. So even without winning, they could change the game. And it didn't end there, right? The Liberty Party, they morphed into something new.
Yep. In 1848, they became the Free Soil Party. Even wider appeal now, attracting not just the abolitionists, but also folks focused on economic fairness.
What were they concerned about?
They argued that if slavery spread, it would limit opportunities for free laborers. They wanted a level playing field.
That's a message that can rally a lot of people.
And their slogan was catchy, too. Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men.
I can see that on a campaign button.
And the Free Soil Party's story also shows how these third-party ideas can become mainstream. Many of them ended up joining the Republican Party, a brand new party at the time.
Taking their ideas with them?
Exactly. It happens a lot in U.S. history. Groups on the outside can spark a change that eventually reshapes the entire political landscape.
Powerful stuff. It's like these early parties were setting the stage for the wave of third parties focused on economic reform that came later.
Absolutely. As we move into the 1900s, with America industrializing like crazy, we see new parties rising to champion farmers and workers.
The little guy against the big corporation.
Exactly. And one of the earliest examples is the Grange movement. It started in the 1870s.
I've heard of the Grange. Weren't they mostly farmers?
Yeah, but they were incredibly organized. They knew that by working together, they could actually challenge the power of the railroads and the banks.
So they weren't just complaining, they were taking action.
They formed cooperatives to buy and sell goods together, and they lobbied hard for laws to regulate those unfair railroad rates. And guess what? They won.
Pretty impressive.
It shows that even today, when people feel powerless against big corporations, collective action can make a real difference.
It's like strength in numbers, right? And that same spirit of fighting for economic justice, we see it again with the Greenback Party.
Oh, yeah, the Greenbacks. They popped up during the 1870s when there was a big currency crisis.
I remember reading about that. Something to do with paper money, right?
That's it. They wanted the government to print more paper money, not backed by gold, called greenbacks. They thought it would help farmers struggling with debt.
But wasn't that a risky move? Printing more money without something to back it up could lead to inflation.
It could, and it did. The Greenback Party ultimately didn't achieve their main goal, but they did shine a spotlight on the economic anxieties of a lot of Americans.
So they brought those concerns to the forefront, even if their solutions didn't quite work out.
Exactly. And those concerns, they really took center stage with the rise of the Populist Party in 1892. This was a big one.
The populists, yeah, they were like a coalition of everyone who felt left behind, right?
Farmers, laborers, reformers, they all came together. And their platform was bold, advocating for things like direct election of senators and a graduated income tax.
Issues that we take for granted today.
Right. They were considered pretty radical at the time, but they reflected a real desire for a more equitable society.
It's amazing how many of their ideas eventually became reality.
They didn't win the presidency, but their signature issue, free coinage of silver, was picked up by William Jennings Bryan, a charismatic Democrat, in the 1896 election.
So even in defeat, their ideas could influence the big leagues.
It shows that third parties can inject new ideas into the mainstream, forcing the two major parties to adapt and evolve.
It's like this ongoing dance, trying to stay relevant, trying to capture the hearts and minds of voters, even if the ideas come from outside their own ranks.
That's a great way to put it. And that dance continued into the early 20th century with the arrival of the Progressive Party in 1912, led by none other than Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt back in the game.
Yeah.
This is where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah. Roosevelt wasn't happy with his chosen successor, William Howard Taft, so he decided to challenge him for the Republican nomination. It was a battle of titans.
So this internal fight within the Republican Party led to the birth of the Progressives.
Exactly. A new party was born out of this clash. And the Progressives, they were pushing for some truly forward-thinking reforms for the time.
Look what?
A minimum wage, laws against child labor, women's right to vote, environmental protection. It was a bold vision for a more just and fair society.
And this is where we get that iconic bull moose moment, right?
You got it. During a campaign stop, Roosevelt was shot. But even wounded, he insisted on giving his speech. He said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose."
What a badass. Talk about dedication to your cause.
It really resonated with people. And even though he didn't win the presidency, his efforts made a lasting impact. The Progressives forced the conversation to change, to grapple with issues of social justice and inequality.
They were trailblazers, weren't they? Paving the way for future generations to tackle those same critical problems.
Absolutely. And it's incredible how these parties, even when they didn't get the ultimate victory, still managed to shift the national conversation.
Makes you wonder if that's not their most lasting legacy, making the big guys listen.
That's a great point. They're a constant reminder that American politics is always in motion, always changing. So we've seen how these third parties can be these huge movements, pushing for big changes in society or the economy.
Yeah, like those farmer labor parties fighting against the monopolies, or the progressives pushing for workers' rights and protecting the environment.
Right. Really inspiring stuff.
For sure.
But there's another side to this whole third party thing, a more focused approach. We're talking about single issue parties.
The groups that really hone in on one specific cause.
Exactly. And one of the best examples, one that really lasted, is the Prohibition Party.
The Prohibition Party. Those were the folks who wanted to ban alcohol completely, right?
That's them. They popped up in the late 1800s when there was all this worry about the negative effects of alcohol on society.
Yes, interesting how our view of alcohol has changed so much over time. Back then it was like public enemy number one, blamed for everything.
Oh, yeah. Crime, poverty, families falling apart. The Prohibition Party really tapped into that feeling, and they pushed hard for a total ban on alcohol.
And they actually succeeded for a while, didn't they?
They did. The 18th Amendment got ratified in 1919, making alcohol illegal across the whole country. That's how we got the Prohibition era.
But we all know how that turned out. It's like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. People always find a way around the rules, don't they?
Oh, yeah, they do. Speakeasies popped up everywhere selling illegal liquor. Organized crime got a huge boost, smuggling and selling booze, and it felt like nobody cared about the law anymore.
A social experiment gone wrong, for sure.
Big time. And I bet the very people they were trying to protect with Prohibition children and families probably ended up seeing the worst of it.
Makes sense. Pushing it underground probably didn't help anyone.
Not at all. It created this culture of hypocrisy and lawlessness, the opposite of what they wanted.
But the interesting thing is, even though Prohibition failed, the party itself didn't disappear.
Nope, they adapted. They added other social reforms to their platform so they could keep going even after Prohibition was repealed in 1933.
Wow, so they found a way to stay relevant even when their main issue was kind of dead.
Exactly. It shows how flexible some of these third parties can be. They adjust to the changing times and find new ways to make their voices heard.
A lesson for all of us, right? Never give up on your goals. So let's move on now to the mid-20th century, a time of huge change with the Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, and all these new social movements popping up.
And during this time, we see a new wave of third parties giving voice to those who felt ignored by the main two parties. One that stands out is the States' Rights Party, also known as the Dixiecrats.
The Dixiecrats. Didn't they split off from the Democrats?
They did. It was 1948, and they were furious with President Truman's support for civil rights.
So basically, a party formed in direct opposition to racial equality. It's a reminder that third parties haven't always been on the right side of history, have they?
Sadly, no. The Dixiecrats wanted to keep segregation and white supremacy in the South, and unfortunately, they weren't the only ones with these racist views. We also see groups like the Christian National Party and the National States' Rights Party pushing even more extreme ideas.
A reminder that prejudice and hate have always been a part of the American story. But thankfully, those groups stayed on the fringes with little impact and eventually fizzled out.
True. And on the other side of the fight for racial equality, we see the rise of Black-led third parties like the African American Party and the Freedom Now Party. They were all about empowering Black voters and pushing for racial justice.
Which the major parties were much slower to do.
Absolutely. And one of the most inspiring stories from this time is the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP. They went head-to-head with the all-white Mississippi delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention.
I've read about them. A really brave group of activists challenging the system.
They were. They argued that the official delegation didn't represent Black people in Mississippi and had been chosen through a system that kept Black people from voting.
It was a powerful moment, showing what grassroots organizing and fighting for true representation can achieve. Just their presence at the convention and the stories they told really exposed the ugliness of segregation in Mississippi.
One of the most powerful moments was Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. She talked about the violence and threats she faced trying to register to vote. It was incredibly moving.
And it forced the Democratic Party to face its own problems with race and inclusion.
It did. And while the MFDP didn't get the all-white delegation kicked out, their efforts paved the way for more Black people to participate in politics in the years that followed.
Proving that even when third parties don't win right away, they can plant seeds for change that grow over time.
Exactly. And as the fight for civil rights continued, another issue started taking over the headlines: the Vietnam War. And this, too, led to new third parties challenging the system.
Like the Peace and Freedom Party formed in 1967, right?
Right. They wanted the war to end, but they also wanted a more socialist economic system. It shows how those two issues, social justice and economic justice, can go hand in hand.
And they attracted some interesting people to their cause, didn't they? Like Dick Gregory, the comedian.
Yeah, Gregory was a major voice for peace and social justice. He led a group that split off from the Peace and Freedom Party, and he even went on a 40-day fast to protest the war.
That's commitment.
It got people's attention, that's for sure. And with the anti-war movement growing stronger, it must have put huge pressure on the major parties to do something. It definitely did.
Well,
and that pressure played a role in President Johnson deciding not to run for re-election in 1968. It shows the power that third parties and grassroots activism can have.
It's a reminder that even when people feel like they don't have a voice, if they come together and speak out, they can actually make a difference.
You got it. And that brings us to another key figure in the anti-war movement, Senator Eugene McCarthy.
Eugene McCarthy, wasn't he a Democrat?
He was, but in 1968, fueled by the anti-war energy, he decided to challenge President Johnson for the Democratic nomination.
So he ran against his own party's president.
He did. And his campaign really captured the hope and idealism of the anti-war movement.
And it worked.
He did surprisingly well in the primaries, which showed just how strong the anti-war sentiment was becoming, and that played a part in Johnson deciding to step down.
Wow. So even working within a major party, these movements can shake things up and force the establishment to listen to the people. It's really something else how these third-party movements, even when they don't win the whole thing, still manage to make such a big impact.
It really is. They're a constant force for change in American politics. And looking back at all these examples, I'm curious what stands out to you as their biggest contribution.
I think it has to be their dedication to those voices that the two-party system often ignores.
Yeah.
They're always pushing the boundaries, bringing new ideas to the table, challenging the status quo, even when it seems like they don't stand a chance.
Right. And they act as this constant reminder that, hey, there are other ways of thinking, other ways of tackling the problems we face as a country.
And they force the major parties to adapt, to actually address those issues they might otherwise sweep under the rug, to see things from different perspectives.
Absolutely. It's like they bring a dose of healthy competition to the system. They make sure it doesn't get too stuck in its ways, too out of touch with what people really need.
So to everyone listening, the next time you find yourself feeling frustrated with the limitations of the two-party system, remember the legacy of these third parties.
Remember the people who dared to challenge the system, to speak up for change, and fight for a more just and inclusive society.
Their stories are a powerful reminder that building a more perfect union is a process that never ends, and that every voice, no matter how small, can make a difference.
Absolutely.
And that's a wrap on our deep dive into the fascinating world of third parties in U.S. politics.
Thanks for joining us.
We hope you've enjoyed this journey through history, and that you have a newfound appreciation for these unsung heroes of American democracy.